A very good afternoon to you. This is your Daytime Update as we continue keeping you abreast of all the day's breaking and developing stories. Stakeholders have raised concerns after revelations that Johnson Johnson as well as Pfizer have requested that the government establish a no-fault compensation fund, exempting them from liability for any harm that may be caused by their vaccines. The scheme would limit claims for severe side effects from COVID-19 vaccines to the fund or the government. Now, government only gave the public 5 days to comment on this matter. For more on this, I'm joined on the line by Rob Hutchinson. He's the MD of lobby group DearSA. Good to have you with us once again this afternoon, Mr. Hutchinson. Perhaps let's start by way of background. What Pfizer and Johnson Johnson, in effect, are saying to South Africans and to the South African government.
Well, what they're asking for is absolute indemnity from any vaccine injury that might arise from the administration of the vaccine, and more specifically, any COVID-19 vaccine. So as we know, this is in development, and it is not really being extensively tested as normal vaccines would be. And in order to get preferential placement on that procurement ladder, the vaccine manufacturers have demanded that the government put in an indemnity scheme such as we are seeing here, which literally shifts the responsibility of any injury from the manufacturer and onto this scheme, which is government funded, ultimately taxpayer funded.
And what has been the South African government's response to this?
Well, they are going ahead with it. Obviously, we've seen it published here under the Disaster Management Act, and more specifically in the regulations thereof. And they are complying in order to secure the 30 million doses that they have requested. And they will be rolling out this scheme in its entirety, although it is pretty unclear as to how the scheme will operate and function or be funded.
So talk to us about the input that government wanted from South Africans, even though they gave people just 5 days, and some of those days were actually over a weekend. How did government reach out to its people?
Oh, well, it didn't. In plain and simple terms, government didn't reach out, which is what we've seen throughout this whole entire COVID thing over the past year, is government, and specifically the minister, publishes regulations or amendments to the Disaster Management Act and goes unnoticed by the public. They don't advertise it in any way or form. We just happen to pick it up in the Government Gazette and parliamentary notes, and then we published it on our website. And we saw this before, right at the beginning, almost a year ago, with the amendments around the sale of tobacco products. And the minister then again published it over a long weekend at that time, and we managed to pick it up, luckily, and provided 12,000 comments through to the minister, which gave us a wonderful opportunity to refute her claims that 2,000 people had said, yes, we vote in favour of the banning of tobacco products, which is obviously not the case, because we kept it. So we're expecting the same with this exact same behaviour of once again rolling it out over a weekend. But luckily we picked it up and managed to send over 23,000 individual submissions through to the minister.
And tell us about the nature of these submissions that were submitted to government, to the minister.
Well, they were public submissions, so drafted by the public. We provided the information as much information as we could find surrounding the scheme and the actual scheme itself in the brief notes that are published there. And we allowed the public to comment on that through a very simple mechanism. So majority, in fact 99.9% of the public comments oppose this ill-conceived scheme, and we have to call it ill-conceived, as there is very scant details on how it will be funded or monitored or administered, or even the terminology used is a vaccine injury. It is far too broad. There are no clear definitions as to what that entails.
Now, you and your organization have called this a, quote, a gross violation of the right to just administrative action, the fact that you haven't been, and South Africans haven't been given an opportunity to comment on this particular scheme. But what then now is the way forward? Are you calling or asking for the minister to once again reopen the commentary section? Are you asking them not to agree to the terms that Johnson Johnson and Pfizer have put in place? Are you asking them for more input as to how this initial 250 million rand that they say that they will be setting aside, how that will be administered?
Yes, well, all of the above. The main point here is that generally regulations aren't put out for public comment. They're up to the minister's sole discretion to tabulate and to formulate. When there's an amendment bill, then the public by law must be involved in the processing and formulation of that bill. So it comes as a surprise that such an extensive and important and potentially costly scheme is being housed under regulations where the minister has sole discretion and the public have no say therein whatsoever. So our first request was to extend the comment period because it is extremely important that people have their say. The private sector knows a lot about these things and therefore should be involved in the formulation of a scheme. But what we no doubt, we've had no response from the minister, even though we set a deadline. So our next step forward now will be to a court challenge to remove it from the Disaster Management Act itself. The danger of housing it in the Disaster Management Act or under the Disaster Management Act is that we will potentially see a perpetual lockdown. The scheme talks about compensation for vaccine injuries, which could present themselves in 10 years' time. We really don't have enough information of that. Does that mean we will be under a constant state of national state of disaster for that entirety of the scheme? Well, yes, if it's held under the Disaster Management Act, we could be facing that.
So how will the current status quo affect those who have either already taken the vaccine or those who intend to take the vaccine when it does become readily available to everybody?
Well, they can still receive the vaccine. Anyone can still receive it when the country has secured the 30 million doses. However, for a private manufacturer to totally recluse himself from any liability poses a massive problem. We've already seen instances of blood clotting and severe rashes and so on. And once again, the terminology of a vaccine injury is so broad at this stage, we really don't know what it could be. So the other major point about this policy is that it clearly states that the manufacturers have no liability and a claim can only be made against government, which is the taxpayer. So, it's once people who've received it, they might have had injury immediately, whether it's a rash or diarrhea is even mentioned there, or something small, but there might be major complications coming later.
Are you aware of whether South Africa is the only country that has received these type of clauses, or do these seem to be standard across the board, irrespective of whether you're dealing with the United States or you're dealing with the United Kingdom or with a country on the African continent?
No, South Africa is not the only country. The vaccine manufacturers are placing the same terms on many countries. So it seems to be a global effort, obviously because there's only a handful of manufacturers. But that makes it even more concerning as to why they would recluse themselves completely from liability and insist on it. It's almost as if they're holding major countries, and including South Africa, to ransom. You can buy our vaccines only if we are removed from all and total liability. It definitely raises some very interesting questions there.
And a lot of additional consequences and complications as well, if you think about it. I mean, if you look at it from the wake of some countries advocating for vaccine passports, meaning then that it will be, obligatory for you to actually take the vaccine if you want to travel, But then if Johnson Johnson and Pfizer and those who are providing the vaccine are basically washing their hands clean and saying if anything happens, it's up to you, but then the world powers and borders are basically pushing you in a position where you have no choice, I think that in itself is problematic and opens itself up to a lot of potential, human rights issues there. I wonder if that's something that you would be looking into as well.
Definitely. Well, you can't force mandatory vaccines onto a population. It's unconstitutional to do so. However, you can bring across mandatory vaccinations through the use of vaccine passports. So in other words, you make the passport mandatory, not the vaccine. So it is a loophole that's being exploited worldwide. However, the big issue here is the issue of trust. Will the public trust a vaccine when the manufacturer themselves has reclused themselves of complete indemnity? That's the big question that has to be asked. If the vaccine manufacturer was confident in their product, they wouldn't be seeking such drastic measures and placing the entire liability on governments and taxpayers.
Mr. Hutchinson, thank you very much for your time as well as your insight into this particular development. That's Rob Hutchinson, is the MD of lobby group DearSA. We'll continue watching that story quite closely for you and give you updates as and when they emerge.